Hey, are we building our houses wrong? You have to pay for water because for some reason our roofs don't catch and filter the rain. You can produce your own cooking gas if you simply stuck your kitchen scraps in a biodigester. Heating and cooling your home is expensive, but if you ran pipes underneath your flooring, you can heat your home with hot water produced from a big pile of wood chips. And since you have those pipes already, if you dug yourself a little backyard pond and ran cold water through it, you can cool your home in the summer. Alternatively, you can heat your Canadian home with 1 cord of wood if you built a rocket mass heater. And you know what else is expensive? Insulation. You can grow your own mycelium insulation super easy. Speaking of growing, if you grew duckweed in that little pond, you'd have a high protein feed source for your chickens. And then your chickens can be a pest control and a fertilizer for your garden. Toss in some solar or wind and you're living free. All these techs plus more are included in what I call Design Home Design. When you are first starting to build your food storage, I do not want you to buy this. And I especially don't want you to buy anything like these. The base of your food storage is 400 pounds of grain. For $500, you can get a year's supply of food in the form of wheat. You cannot do that with canned goods, and you definitely can't do that with prepper kits. You'll also need 50 to 100 pounds of beans. Go to Costco and buy 2 bags, you're done. After that, all that is necessary for a year's supply of food is 10 quarts of oil. Only once you have those things should you start getting fancy and bulking up on this. I do not like earthships. I do not like passive homes. Both for the same reason. Cost. Earthships is labor cost. Before you build an earthship, I want you to go outside and pound dirt into a tire. Building an earthship is a long, difficult, exhausting job. Yes, once they're done, they're awesome, but most earthships never get finished. People almost always give up halfway through. Passive homes are another great design. The only problem is they are ridiculously expensive to build. Yes, once they're done, you can do what they claim and heat your home with a hairdryer, which is a good thing because once you've built a passive home, you don't have any money left, which is why I designed option number 3. And I call it the Zion Home. I wanted to keep the good ideas from earthships and from passive homes, but I wanted to scrap the cost. So instead of focusing on over-engineering the structure, my focus was on the systems. Because I don't care how you build your house. It can be a typical stick frame, or it can be a yurt. The systems are what makes a house function. And if you make the systems self-reliant, you can bring your costs down to 0 without massive upfront costs. So I have a question for you. Why did the Persians, the Chinese, and the Spanish all have courtyards? They don't live near each other, so it's not a cultural thing, and yet they all decided that homes should be in a U shape and the opening should be facing north. That's because these civilizations lived in hot climates. And a courtyard is actually how they kept their homes cool in the summer. By having these walls surround the area, the courtyard is protected and always in the shade. And heat always chases cold. So by creating this cooler protected spot on the sides of your house, it would help draw the heat out of your home. So courtyards have an actual function. And because they're protected from the elements, they're a great place for recreation, including if you want to add a pool. In fact, adding a pool increases the effectiveness of your courtyard. Now, obviously, this isn't a replacement for air conditioning, but it can decrease your load, which means you don't need as much power. Ancient civilizations, they were masters at shaping their environments. They didn't have electricity or machines, so they had to design systems around it. The Romans, they were insane enough to invent indoor plumbing without plumbing. For thousands of years, they had running water without pipes. And the Persians, they were experts at air conditioning. The Arabians mastered the art of courtyards. The ancient world didn't have electricity, but they still figured out how to make ice in the desert. India built these massive stepwells so that way they could capture the rain and use it for irrigation. Meanwhile, the Aztecs, they straight up just decided to farm on the water. They took advantage of aquaponics to grow a lot of food. And the American Indians, they purposely crafted their forests to be brimming full of food. The Chinese were master craftsmen. Their inventions are what made the industrial age even possible. And the Koreans, they had in-floor heating via an ondol. And meanwhile, the Incas, they just terraformed entire mountains. So what does this have to do with self-reliance? Well, a lot of these ideas you can still use. Ice houses are super cool, but have you ever heard of a Yakhchal? A Yakhchal is an ancient Persian ice house with a couple of really cool features. An ice house, at its simplest, is literally just an insulated structure that you stick ice in. It can be made of wood and sawdust or stone, doesn't matter as long as it protects the ice. A Yakhchal is a community-sized ice house with 3 really cool features. The first one being this giant wall. You see, Persia is a high desert, which means even during the winter, it's still hot. Except at night. So what they did is they built this big wall to protect a shallow pool of water. So that way, overnight, the water would freeze into thin sheets of ice that they could then add to the Yakhchal. Design element number 2 is the cone shape. People on the internet have claimed that this is for ventilation. It's not. It's literally just a skylight. The job of ventilation belonged to the wind catchers. With the aid of the wind, they would bring in cooler air and suck out the hot air. This is a sleeping porch, something that used to be very common in the South. Before the invention of air conditioning, sleeping inside during the summertime sucked, especially in hot climates like the Deep South. You see, when we build homes, we want them to be very insulated so we don't freeze to death during the winter. But that becomes a problem during the summer. If you've ever lived without air conditioning, even for a day or so, you'll notice that the inside is way hotter than the outside in the evening. That's because the insulation is doing its job and not letting the heat escape the house. So before air conditioning was invented, a lot of homes had sleeping porches. It could be just a full-fledged porch like what you see in this picture. But it didn't have to be a porch. This is just an upper room in a house. But the idea behind these porches was so that way you could open up all these windows and get a nice steady breeze. Is this a replacement for air conditioning? Absolutely not. But this might be one design aspect that you keep tucked away when you're designing your off-grid home. Especially if you just need a small cabin for the kids to stay during the summer. I don't like sand batteries. This is a sand battery. It's a way to store the energy from things like solar panels and windmills. It's literally just a big container filled with sand. And how it operates is basically the same idea as your toaster. Buried in your big pile of sand, you have metal rods. And when you have excess energy on sunny or windy days, you pump that extra energy into these metal rods, heating them up. And the cool thing about sand is it's very good at holding onto heat, and you need thousands of degrees to melt it. So, if you have a ton of excess energy, you can heat this pile up to ridiculous temperatures. Okay, so what's your point? You have a big pile of hot sand now. Well, at its simplest form, a sand battery can be used to heat your home in the winter. A more advanced idea is using that heat to create steam, which you then use to generate power. Now that I've explained what it is, I'll explain why I don't like it. Sand batteries are great for large projects. I'm a self-reliant homesteader. You as an individual will not be generating enough electricity to make it worthwhile. Here are 10 incredible fruits that you can grow yourself that you will never find in a grocery store. And most of these have varieties that are native to the US. Number 1, pawpaw. The United States is not a tropical region. So if you want some tropical flavors, pawpaw is one of your best options. Think banana, pineapple, mango flavoring. Number 2, thimbleberry. Very closely related to raspberry, but with a stronger flavor profile. Number 3, maypaw. It's related to the passion flower, and it's another tropical tasting fruit. Number 4, currants. They come in either black, red, or white varieties. Number 6 is related to currants, and that's gooseberries. Depending on the variety, think of this as a early season grape. Number 7 is gummy berries. It's a really sweet red berry that fixes nitrogen. Then there's number 8, its cousin, the autumn olive. This fruit has some incredible health benefits. Number 9 is the Saskatoon, Juneberry, shad bush, lots of names. This is very similar to blueberries, but way easier to grow. And number 10 is the sea berry. This berry tastes a lot like citrus. Now, if you want a list of my favorite fruit trees, check out the description and the link in my bio. When you live in a hot climate, keeping your home cool is very important, especially off-grid. So here are some passive design elements to keep your home cool. Number 1, there's a reason why my walls are white. There's a reason why almost all southern houses were white. Having white exterior paint really does make a difference. Same thing with your roof. It should be silver or white. Number 2, window shutters. Real, genuine shutters are not just decorative. Their job is to close and protect the window from sunlight. Now you can use blackout curtains, but they're not quite as effective because the heat has already entered your house, whereas shutters keep the heat on the outside. Number 3 is tall ceilings and a way to vent the heat. The heat in your home rises and you send it outside. And on that same note, number 4, traditional southern homes had tall, skinny windows. This is a poor example, but the bottom would be opened up to let cooler air in and the top would be opened up as a vent. And number 5, homes in hot climates used to have courtyards. That's because the courtyard would actually draw the heat out of the house. You just don't understand how awesome wind catchers are. This is ancient Persian air conditioning. Long before we had electricity, we needed a way to keep our homes cool in the summer, and the Persians were just clever. You see, wind, due to its velocity, is a lot cooler than the air on the ground. So how a wind catcher works at its simplest is air goes in, down into your house, cooling it off. However, that's the crappiest, most basic version of a wind catcher. It works, especially in desert climates where the nights are cold, but usually you would want to take advantage of evaporative cooling. When air hits water, it cools off. So these wind catchers would have wet pads that the air would have to pass through before it enters the house. But we're still not done yet. There's a third option. They had cisterns filled with ice water, and the tower would send that air down over the water to cool it before it enters the home. So now we've introduced cooler air, but we're still not done yet because we still have to vent the hot air. You see, wind catchers always work in pairs, and the second tower would use the wind to create a vacuum to suck the hot air out. If you want to live off-grid, here's a few technologies you can use to keep cool in the summer. You see, air conditioning uses a lot of power. So most homesteaders build a small house so that way there's not a lot of space that you have to cool. Alternatively, you can build a big house, but you'll pay a pretty penny to cool it with air conditioning. So the first tech that I want to talk about is earth tubes. They work great in climates where the soil has low ambient temperature. So pretty much anywhere that isn't hot and humid. The idea is as the air flows through the earth into your home, it will naturally be cooled off. That idea works great if the soil is cool, but in the deep south, it's not. And there's one other major problem. Same with heat pumps. Moving dirt is expensive. Speaking of geothermal, moving dirt's expensive, but if you have a pond, water is much more efficient at heat transfer than dirt. The second tech works really well in arid environments. This is a cooling tower at the Zion National Park. It's a similar concept to wind catchers. It's basically a passive swamp cooler. So direct evaporative cooling works great in desert environments. But what if you live somewhere where it's humid? You can still use it, but you won't want to have it cool the inside of your home. Instead, you can use the evaporation to keep your roof from gaining any heat. Can you speak on wind power? Is a wind turbine worth it? We live on a large hill and get a lot of wind 80% of the time. Could we harness it? Yes, windmills are one of the best ways to generate energy off-grid, especially if you live on top of a hill. Now notice, I use the words power and energy, not just electricity. But yes, if you live in a place where you get a good breeze, for example, a hill, and you put your turbine on top of a tall tower, you will generate a lot of electricity. And there's a good chance that you'll be able to generate more electricity than solar panels on a per-cost basis. Especially if you live in the wind belt. That's this blue section right here. But windmills are not just electricity generators. In fact, one of the best ways to use them is to compress air and pump water. You need a strong breeze to generate electricity. You only need a minor breeze to pump water and compress air. And compressed air is really cool because one of the biggest expenses off-grid is batteries. And you can use compressed air as a form of energy storage. So would I say a windmill is worth it? Absolutely. You should be doing solar panels because windmills suck. One problem, that is false! Windmills are freaking awesome! Especially the further north you are. And don't get me wrong, solar panels are great. Especially if you live in the sun belt. But if you live somewhere where there's wind, windmills can easily produce twice the amount of power on a per-cost basis. However, there is one thing you have to keep in mind. If you want your windmill to produce power, it has to be high. This is too short. This is a water windmill. This is surrounded by buildings. It will never generate power. If you want to generate power, you have to obey the 30-30 rule. If you want your windmill to actually generate power, it has to be 30 feet higher than anything within 300 feet. Now I'm going to drop some numbers, but just to be clear, these are illustrative numbers. Their job is to make a point, not to be accurate. Let's say you have a 2,000 watt generator on a 10-foot tower. That'll generate like 200 watts. So like 10%. On a 20-foot tower, that's more like 30%. On a 30-foot tower, 70%. 40-foot tower, 90%. If you put it on a low tower, it's just not going to generate a lot of power. Here's the cool thing about chickens and pigs. They're woodland creatures. And if you're at all like me, you love trees. In fact, I'm writing a book about different trees that are useful for homesteading. But like any plant, trees need fertilizer. And you probably don't want your apples to be full of worms. The cool thing about pigs and chickens is they provide both fertilizer and pest control. Every orchard should have an army of chicken, and every grove should have an army of pigs. Especially if that grove is a wood crop, like for instance, black walnut. Because here's the cool thing about pigs. They're supposed to get fat off of nuts, not grains. Traditionally, they would get fattened off of chestnuts, acorns, and walnuts. Meanwhile, chickens are supposed to eat bugs. You know what a forest is full of? Worm-infested apples will drop to the ground before the others are ripe. Send in the chickens. They'll eat the bugs, and then there's no worms for next year. And the same thing goes for the nut crops. The pigs will love you if you stick them in a forest full of nuts. And then when it's time to harvest, you just move them out and harvest the good nuts. Hey, are we building our houses wrong? Why aren't we using sheep's wool to insulate our homes? We know that wool clothes are warm, so why don't we use them for insulation? The truth is, we actually do, in some applications. Fiberglass insulation is by far the most popular, but that's because it's cheap. Wool insulation is more effective, fire resistant, and does not mold. And then my favorite benefit as a former HVAC technician is wool is not itchy like fiberglass. But here's the thing, of course, wool costs more. That is, if you buy it. But what if it's a byproduct of your sheep meat production? And it's really not that ridiculous. Let's do some quick math. Let's say I wanted to use wool to insulate my home. It's about 20 by 30 feet. Over the course of a year, you can shear a sheep about twice. And that'll give you about 10 to 15 pounds of wool. Skipping all the really boring math, you need about 40 pounds per wall. And then you also have your roof and your floor. So if I want to insulate my home, I need 12 sheep for 2 years, or 25 sheep for 1 year. And of course, if you have lots of land and are in a hurry, you need 50 sheep for about 6 months. And the cool thing about sheep is they don't need a ton of land, so 50 sheep isn't that ridiculous. For thousands of years, humanity has been building houses out of nothing but mud and sticks. So here are the top 5 most common ways. Number 1, rammed earth. You build a wooden form and then you just smash the earth in until it's really compact and tight. Earth ships are a type of rammed earth home. Number 2 is Europe's favorite. You have cobbed houses. Cob is a mixture of clay, sand, and straw, and you literally just mold your house. Number 3 is Central America's favorite. Adobe. Same thing as a cob house. It's a mixture of sand, clay, and straw, but instead of molding it, they would create clay bricks that they would then build with. Number 4 is called a wattle. Basically, you weave branches together and then you stick mud on both sides of the wall. And then number 5, straw clay. This can be straw clay in the form of bricks, like adobe, or you can use forms and ram it similar to rammed earth. But with this, you're using a lot more straw and a lot less clay. And they're all great options with great thermal mass. Did you know that in ancient Korea, they would heat their homes by lighting a fire underneath their floors? It's not as crazy as it sounds. They called this an ondol. On the outside, there's a furnace stovetop where they would light the fire. The fire would then spread through the floor and up through the chimney. And they would have these baffles to send the fire all across the house. This was a primitive form of radiant heating. And in modern Korean houses, they use radiant floor heating, but they still call it an ondol. The problem with modern ondols is they use a lot of power. And if you're off-grid, you just can't spare that amount of energy. And I'm really not interested in lighting a fire underneath my house. So a similar concept would be a rocket mass heater. You light a fire, and the fire heats up this mass, and the mass heats the home. But I'm not doing a rocket mass heater. I'm doing in-floor heat. But instead of using a boiler to heat my water, I'm using a compost pile. I need hot water for cleaning purposes anyway, so might as well build the pile big enough to heat my home. And before you ask, extracting heat from a compost pile is called the Gene Payne method or bio-mylar. Did you know that 1/3 of your white sugar doesn't come from sugarcane? It comes from sugar beets. Sugarcane grows in the tropics. The advantage of sugar beets is that they grow in colder climates. They're also a lot easier to grow. And these beets are not small. You only need about 3.5 sugar beets to create about a pound of sugar. Now, all of the sugar is found in the roots, but the grains of beets are also edible. You can either eat them or you can feed them to your livestock. And once you use these to create the sugar that you want, you can use the leftover mush and feed that to your livestock. So how do you turn sugar beets into sugar? It's honestly really simple. You dice them up into small little cubes or French fries. You then boil them to extract all of that sugar. Eventually you take that mush out and you just boil that sugar water down until it starts to crystallize. And then once the crystallization is done, you just scrape it out of the pan and you have sugar. If you are in a survival situation, you can use acorns as a high-calorie source and you can use them to make bread. The catch is, acorns are full of tannins, which makes them bitter. So if you want to use the acorns, you have to leach out the tannins. And doing this is honestly really simple. First, obviously, you have to crack the acorns. While you are cracking them, store them in a bowl full of water. Once you have them all cracked, you can stick them in a blender to blend them up. If you're in a survival situation, you just have to grind them up. Once you've pulverized your acorns, you stick them into a container and fill that container up with water. And you let it sit for a while. Once the mush has separated fully from the water, you drain that water and you do it again. And you keep doing that, where you're refilling it up with fresh water until the water starts to look like this. But more importantly, you taste the acorn mush, and if it still tastes bitter, you're not done. Once that bitter taste is all gone, the tannins are gone, and you can use that flour. And to turn that mush into flour, all you have to do is spread it out and dry it. In my opinion, the best climate zones for you to homestead are within zones 7 and 8. Now that's not to negate my previous videos where I've talked about the Zion region being the best place to homestead overall. And that is contained within 5, 6, and 7. But the climate zones 7 and 8 have an advantage that most of the globe does not. And that's especially true if you love fruit. This might be boring for half a second, but bear with me. Overly super simplified. The global population either lives in a temperate zone or a tropical zone, and that includes hot deserts and cold deserts. The temperate zones further can be split into two sections. You have the subtropics and what's known as continental. Almost all of your favorite fruits either grow in the continental zone or the subtropical zone. All of your colder fruits include things like apples, pears, and peaches. Your subtropic fruits include lemons, limes, and pomegranates. But here's the cool thing. Most of your cold fruits go down to growing zones 7 and 8. Most of your subtropical fruit can go up to zones 7 and 8. If you're in zone 7, you will have access to almost all of the colder fruits and some of the subtropic. And if you are in zone 8, you will have most of the subtropical fruits and a lot of the colder fruit. I have something cool to show you guys. This is a cutting from a mimosa tree. The flowers of a mimosa tree are an incredible mood booster, and the inner bark of the mimosa is a antidepressant. This is why the nickname for this tree is the happiness tree. And like most plants, you can propagate it from cuttings. When you take a cutting, you want it to be fresh, green, new growth, and you want at least one leaf. And just so we're clear, this is one leaf. All these little things are called leaflets. This is one leaf. And personally, I just find this really fascinating. Look at these leaflets, how they're all closed up. That's because I've been messing with them. When they're on the tree, they're opened up and they're just fluttering in the wind and it looks great. But to protect these leaflets from animals and from storms, the mimosa tree will close them up. Anyway, the mimosa tree is a very popular ornamental tree. When I was down in southern Utah, it was everywhere. But it's also extremely useful for self-reliance. And it's not just medicine, it's a great nitrogen fixer, which means it helps your fruit trees grow faster. This tree and many others will be included in my upcoming book. When you are trying to live off-grid or be self-reliant, where you live determines what you're going to do. Only a moron tries planting citrus in the Arctic. If you're living in the tropics, you really don't need to worry about heating your home. My end goal is to have a house design that meets people's needs in each core climate zone. And luckily, there's only a finite number of climate zones. There's the frozen wastelands of Canada and Northern Europe. That's also known as the Subarctic. Then about half of humanity lives in what's known as the temperate zone. And then, of course, there's the tropics. Those three can be divided into wet, humid regions and dry regions. About 1 billion people live in hot, dry climates. But then, of course, you can break those down into subcategories. There's the tropical rainforests of Brazil, or the tropical savannas, like, for instance, in India. There's hot deserts, but there's also cold deserts. And luckily, while the core needs of humanity don't change, there are different systems that you can use depending on what your region is. Here are the 6 water systems you need to live off-grid. Number 1, you need a way to acquire water. This can be done through a pond, rain catchment, or you can pay the piper and dig a well. Number 2, you need a way to pressurize the water. And there's many ways to do this, but a pressure tank or a water tower are examples. Number 3, you probably want your water to be clean. If your water source is good, you don't need a filter. Some lactobacterium or bleach will suffice. But if you need a filter, they're not hard to buy or to build. Number 4 is, you need a way to have hot water. Solar heaters are a popular trend. They suck. And you can always buy a propane heater, but my favorite is a compost water heater. Number 5, you need a place for your wastewater to go. Most commonly, this is done with a septic tank. But if you use a biodigester, you can create biogas. And you can use biogas to fuel your gas stove. And then number 6, if you are short on water, you need a way to reuse it. Your shower water is not that dirty. Run it through a filter. This is what's known as gray water. And it's the easiest water to use over and over again. If you want to be self-reliant in cold climates, there's a few hurdles you have to overcome. Can you make a video about the essentials for living off-grid in a subarctic climate? Your biggest challenges include heating your home, your pathetic growing season, and being able to produce enough power. Solar panels hate winter. There's a reason why almost all Canadians are squished into the little Great Lakes region, and your default term for electricity is hydro. First, let's talk about your growing season. There are plenty of fruits with specific varieties that can grow all the way down to like zone 3. Yes, apples are one of them, so are sour cherries. But for most of your produce, you'll probably need a heated greenhouse. And a great way to heat that is with a compost heater. To heat your home, you'll want a rocket mass heater. With a traditional furnace, most of the heat goes out the window. With a rocket mass heater, almost all the heat is contained within this bench, and then the bench emanates heat throughout the day. And then power. In the summertime, solar panels are great. You'll have really long days. But in the wintertime, you might be screwed if you don't have wind or hydro. There are downsides to everything, and the Zion home is no exception. So what are the downsides to your systems and house design? Number 1, some things you have to build yourself. A contractor is not going to know what a rocket mass heater is. If you want reliable hot water, you have to build a compost pile every 6 to 12 months. If you go with a solar water heater, cloudy days suck. If you want air conditioning, you either have to design it into the building or keep your house relatively small so the AC doesn't use a ton of power. And you need some way to generate power. Solar panels hate the winter. And windmills, they kind of require wind. Some days, you won't have enough biogas to cook, and you'll have to do something outdoors like kebabs. Darn. If you live in a dry region, you might be a little tight on water. To get around this, you just have to run your gray water through a filter. And to heat your home, you will need a little bit of firewood. But the biggest con, the con that will hold almost everyone back, is you need at least $20,000. You just can't build a house with modern comforts absolutely free. Did you know that if you don't have access to water, you can capture it from the air? Air wells are a very advanced but simple technology. I'm pretty sure you've all seen this before. Morning dew happens due to condensation, and it's a really simple concept. When a cold object meets warm, moist air, water condensates, and an air well simply takes advantage of that phenomenon. In this example, it's stone, but it doesn't have to be. This is a Warka water tower, and it uses a plastic mesh. But whatever the material is, you want it so that way it can capture the water vapor in the air. And then you're just going to want a container so that way those water droplets have a place to fill. Basically, you're just building a structure that will collect the morning dew. The key is you need a lot of surface area, and it needs to be somewhere where there's humidity. Because how the dew point works is the hotter the air, the more water it can hold. And at nighttime, when the air cools off, if it's a really humid air, that water has to condensate. Now, air wells work great, but if you have a lot of rain, you don't need them. So where they work best is hot, humid environments with long, dry seasons. Have you ever thought about building your home with hemp? I was asked to give my thoughts on hempcrete, so here they are. And just to be clear, hemp is not marijuana. It's not for drugs. And using hemp as insulation can be categorized into 3 groups. You have hemp wool, hempcrete, and hemp block. First, let's talk about hemp wool. I don't like it. It really should be called hemp straw, because that's what it is. And like all fibrous material, it's highly flammable. They treat it so it's not as flammable as it could be, but I still don't like it. Now, it does have some advantages, like for instance, it does help limit humidity. But let's talk about hempcrete. Hempcrete is very flame resistant, very mold resistant. But the big catch with hempcrete is it's very labor intensive. Hempcrete is essentially a rammed earth home with straw. You have to build forms and then tamp it down, which takes a lot of effort. Really good stuff, a lot of time. Hemp block is kind of the workaround. You're trading time and labor for money. Hemp block is essentially blocks of hempcrete designed to be built together like Legos. Hempcrete is made of cheap material. Hemp block is not cheap. Overall, I like hempcrete, but I would only do it for the first 2 feet of my house. Can you discuss the cooling systems for the Zion home? Absolutely. Let's start with the simplest. If you have a small house, an air conditioner works great. And I mean small, not tiny. It doesn't have to be a tiny home. The cool thing about solar panels and air conditioning is you need air conditioning right about the time when you're producing the most power. So air conditioning works fine, especially if your house is white in the shade and you cover your windows. Next up, there's wind catchers. Think of them as ancient swamp coolers that use no electricity. This technology works great in arid environments. But for a lot of you, that's not an option. So let's talk about ice pits. During the wintertime, you can fill a pit full of ice, and then during the summer, you can use that ice to cool your home. But here's the cool thing about rivers and creeks. They tend to be kind of cold, and you can use that cold water as a refrigerant. You see, how a normal air conditioner works is you have a fan blow warm air over a cold pipe. If you have a creek, that cold pipe can be simply filled with cold water. And then once you're done, you can simply just dump it back into the water, or you could pump it to the top of your roof and let it evaporate.